Get a job or get out, my daughter-in-law shouted across the dinner table. Her voice cut through the room so sharply that even the clink of silverware stopped. The words didn't sound like anger. They sounded rehearsed, like something she had been holding on to, waiting for the right moment to throw. I didn't respond. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask what I had done wrong. I simply looked down at my plate. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story. And tell me which city you're watching from. I never imagined I would be telling this, but some stories only make sense once you've lived through them. That night was supposed to be a normal family dinner. Nothing special. Just a Wednesday evening in the house I'd lived in for over 30 years. The same house where I raised my son. The same kitchen where I packed his school lunches, stitched up scraped knees, and waited up late when he was a teenager and missed curfew. The roast had been in the oven for 3 hours. I'd set the table the way I always did, with the placemats I kept folded neatly in the drawer. Nothing fancy, just familiar, comfortable. She sat across from me, arms crossed, eyes sharp. My son sat beside her, staring at his phone as if it were suddenly the most important thing in the world. He didn't look up when she spoke. He didn't flinch. Get a job or get out, she said again, slower this time, as if I hadn't heard her clearly the first time. I waited. Maybe he would say something. Maybe he would remind her whose house this was, or at least ask her to lower her voice. He didn't. The food grew cold between us. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, louder than usual, filling the space where a response should have been. I folded my napkin once. Then again, my hands were steady. I remember noticing that. I'm not asking for much, she continued, her tone changing. Almost reasonable now. We can't support someone who doesn't contribute. Support. The word hung there, heavy and misplaced. I had watched their child every weekday for 3 years, so they wouldn't have to pay for daycare. I cooked dinners, cleaned up toys, handled doctor's appointments. I had dipped in my savings more than once when they were between plans. But none of that counted as contribution anymore. I pushed my chair back quietly. The sound of it scraping against the floor made my son finally look up. For a moment our eyes met. There was something there. Discomfort, maybe. Or guilt. It passed quickly. I didn't mean it like that, he said without conviction. I stood up. I picked up my plate and carried it to the sink. The water ran. I rinsed it clean and placed it carefully on the rack, just like I always did. No shaking, no hesitation. Then I reached for my coat. As I slipped my arms into the sleeves, she watched me closely, as if waiting for tears. For a scene. For proof that her words had landed exactly where she wanted them to. I didn't give her that. I walked out the front door and closed it behind me, gently. The night air was cool, and for the first time that evening, I took a full breath. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't as powerless as they thought. The house felt different after my husband passed. Not quieter, not emptier, just colder. The morning after the dinner, I woke up before the sun. I always did. Habit doesn't disappear just because someone does. I made coffee for 2 out of instinct, then stopped when I realized there was no reason to pour the second cup anymore. His mug was still in the cabinet, the blue one with the chipped handle. I left it there. After the funeral, people had filled the house for a few days. Neighbors, old friends, distant relatives who spoke in soft voices and said things like, "He's in a better place now." Then they left, one by one. The driveway emptied. The phone stopped ringing. That's when the real silence began. My son and his wife moved through the house differently after that. Quicker, less careful. They talked around me instead of to me. Conversation stopped when I entered the room, then resumed once I left. I noticed small things first. My chair at the table pushed slightly out of place. My groceries moved to a lower shelf in the fridge. My name missing from a utility bill that had always come addressed to both my husband and me. No one explained. No one thought they needed to. Grief makes you doubt yourself. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was sensitive, that this was just an adjustment period and I should be patient. I stayed busy. That was my way. I folded laundry that wasn't mine. Cleaned rooms I barely used anymore. Took care of my grandchild when they asked, which was often. Some days I didn't speak until evening. I would sit in the living room, the one my husband and I had furnished together, and listen to the house breathe. the air conditioner kicking on, the floorboards settling, sounds that used to feel like home. Now they just reminded me I was still here. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't know I was in the hallway. She just needs to do something, she said. I mean, it's not like she's contributing. I stood very still. Contributing. That word again. I thought about the check I wrote last winter to help cover their car repairs. The afternoons I spent watching their child so they could get some rest. The savings account I stopped touching because I didn't want to be a burden. I went back to my room and closed the door. Not slammed it. Just closed it. That night, my son avoided me. When I tried to ask him a simple question about the mail, he answered without looking up. His voice sounded tired. Or maybe distant. It was hard to tell anymore. You should probably think about what you want to do next, he said casually, as if we were talking about weekend plans. I nodded. I had learned something important since my husband died. People reveal their plans in pieces, quietly, in the things they assume you won't challenge. They had already decided I didn't belong. So I stopped explaining myself, stopped justifying my presence, stopped waiting for permission. Instead, I began to watch. It became clear they were making decisions without me. I noticed it one afternoon when I came home from a short walk and found boxes stacked neatly in the hallway. My hallway. The one I had walked through every day for decades. They weren't sealed, just folded and waiting, like a suggestion that hadn't yet been spoken out loud. "Oh, we're just organizing," my daughter-in-law said when she saw me looking. Her smile was quick, practiced. "The house feels cluttered lately." Cluttered. That's what she called my life. Later that week, I went to the kitchen to make tea and found my cabinet half empty. My dishes, simple ones, nothing fancy, had been moved to a cardboard box in the pantry. In their place were new plates, still smelling like the store. No one asked me. No one warned me. I carried my mug back to my room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the walls. The same pale color my husband and I had chosen together after our last renovation. He'd said it made the room feel calm. I wondered if calm was just another word for invisible. The next sign came with the mail. A letter from the bank addressed only to my son. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it. For years, those envelopes had come with both our names. Mine and my husband's. Then just mine. Now, not even that. That evening, I asked my son about it. My voice was steady. Careful. "Oh yeah," he said, shrugging. "We're just simplifying things. Makes it easier." Easier for whom? He didn't say. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to remind him that this house didn't simply appear one day, that his father worked overtime for years to pay it off, that I managed every bill, every repair, every crisis. But I didn't. I had learned that questions only invited explanations I wasn't ready to hear. My daughter-in-law grew bolder as the days passed. She spoke freely now, as if my presence no longer required courtesy. "You know," she said one morning while scrolling through her phone, "there are programs for people your age. Job placement stuff, even part-time would help." Help who? I folded laundry and didn't answer. She continued anyway. "I just think everyone should pull their weight." That night, I lay awake replaying her words. Not angry, not crying, just alert. For the first time since my husband died, something sharp cut through the fog of grief. They weren't reacting to my loss. They were responding to an opportunity. The opportunity came from my silence, from my patience, from the way I kept showing up as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. A week later, I overheard them talking in the living room. I had gone to bed early, or so they thought. "If she doesn't do something soon, this is going to drag on," my daughter-in-law said. My son sighed. "I know, but we can't just throw her out." There was a pause. "Well," she replied, lowering her voice, "she could leave on her own." I closed my eyes. That was the moment I understood. The dinner, the shouting, the boxes, the comments. None of it was random. It was pressure. Slow, constant, designed to make me uncomfortable enough to disappear quietly. I stayed in my room the rest of that night. The next morning, I got dressed as usual, combed my hair, put on my coat. I didn't announce where I was going. No one asked. As I stepped outside, I looked back at the house, the windows, the porch, the front door my husband once held open for me every evening when he came home from work. They thought they were waiting me out. They didn't realize I had already stopped waiting. My husband used to say the house would take care of me if he couldn't. He said it one night while we were washing dishes together, years ago. His hands were rough from work, the skin cracked at the knuckles. He dried each plate carefully, the way he always did. "No matter what happens," he said, not looking at me, "you'll never have to worry about where you belong." I didn't think much of it then. We had decades behind us and plans ahead of us. Words like that felt unnecessary. After he died, those words came back to me often. Usually late at night when the house was quiet and my thoughts had room to wander. I remembered the early years, the small apartment, the hand-me-down furniture, the nights he came home exhausted, smelling like oil and dust, and still asked if I'd eaten. We built everything slowly, paycheck by paycheck, room by room. This house wasn't a gift. It was earned. When my son was little, my husband insisted everything be done properly. Paperwork filed, accounts organized. "So nothing ever gets messy later," he used to say. I handled most of it. Bills, savings, insurance. I knew where everything was kept, or at least I thought I did. After the funeral, my daughter-in-law offered to help organize things. She said it kindly, with a hand on my arm and a soft voice. I was tired, still numb. I agreed. That was my mistake. She took over slowly, one folder at a time, one document moved here, another there. She said it was easier if she kept everything in one place. I didn't argue. I trusted her. She was family. Weeks later, I went looking for the file my husband labeled house. It wasn't where it used to be. I searched again, more carefully this time. Still nothing. When I asked her about it, she waved it off. "Oh, we put all that stuff together," she said. "Don't worry about it." Don't worry. I heard that phrase a lot after my husband died. One evening, while folding clothes, I found an old envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside was a note in my husband's handwriting. Short, direct. "Everything's set. You're protected." I sat down on the bed and read it again. Protected. The word settled something inside me. That night, I replayed moments I had ignored. My son letting his wife answer questions meant for him. The way she spoke about the house as if it were already theirs. How easily my name was removed from conversations. It hadn't started with shouting. It started with confidence. Confidence that I wouldn't push back. Confidence that grief had softened me. They believed my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. The next morning I went through my things slowly, carefully. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I made a list of questions instead of accusations. I thought about my husband's voice. Steady, practical, always one step ahead. For the first time since he passed, I felt him close again. Not in memory. In clarity. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't new. And it wasn't unchallenged. I folded the note and placed it back in the drawer. Then I stood up, straightened my coat, and walked out of the room. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was remembering who I had been before they decided I was disposable. The first person who spoke up for me wasn't family. It was Margaret, my neighbor from 2 houses down. We'd known each other for years, mostly through polite waves and short conversations over the fence. After my husband died, she started bringing over soup once a week. Nothing fancy, just something warm, set quietly on the counter. That afternoon, she came by unexpectedly. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through old paperwork, when I heard her knock. "You look tired," she said gently after I let her in. I shrugged. "Just organizing." She glanced around the kitchen, the boxes in the hallway, the missing dishes, the tension in the air that had become permanent. Margaret was observant like that. "Are they giving you trouble?" she asked. I hesitated. For a moment, I almost said no. Habit again, years of smoothing things over. But something in her tone made it harder to lie. "They think I should leave," I said simply. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask why. She just nodded, slowly, as if something had finally made sense. "I wondered," she said. "The way she talks to you. Loud, confident, like she already owns the place." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Margaret sat across from me and folded her hands. "Did your husband ever put anything in writing?" she asked. The question landed carefully, not accusing, not urgent, just practical. "Yes," I said after a moment. "He was very organized." She nodded again. "Good. Then don't assume anything, especially not what they're telling you." That night, her words stayed with me. A few days later, my son's childhood friend stopped by. Daniel. He had grown up in this house, running through these same hallways, eating dinner at this same table. Now he wore a suit and carried himself differently. "I ran into your son," he said awkwardly. "He mentioned changes." I waited. "He said you might be moving," Daniel continued, "that the house was going to be reorganized." Reorganized. Another careful word. Daniel shifted in his seat. That didn't sound right to me. I met his eyes for the first time. "Why not?" "Because," he said slowly, "your husband used to talk about this place like it was yours. Always yours." After he left, I sat alone in the living room. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor the same way it had for decades. I thought about how many people had passed through this house. How many knew its history better than my daughter-in-law ever would? That evening, my son approached me hesitantly. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, "you don't have to make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder for whom?" He didn't say. "I just think," he continued, "if you had something lined up, things would be smoother." I looked at him, really looked at him. The boy I raised, the man standing in front of me now. "I do have something lined up," I said quietly. He seemed relieved. "Good." I didn't explain. Later that night, I took out the note again, the one in my husband's handwriting. I placed it beside the paperwork I had gathered. Margaret's question echoed in my head, Daniel's certainty, even my son's assumptions. They all pointed to the same thing. The truth was already there. I wasn't alone anymore. I just had to decide how much longer I would let them believe I was. The next morning, I changed how I moved through the house. Not dramatically, not noticeably, just enough. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling silences. When my daughter-in-law spoke, I listened without reacting. When my son asked vague questions, I answered vaguely in return. "I'm just running an errand," I would say. "I'm taking care of something." They didn't press. They assumed, as they always had, that whatever I was doing wasn't important. That worked in my favor. I began leaving the house at the same time every morning, coat on, purse in hand. I didn't announce where I was going. No one asked. By the third day, they stopped noticing altogether. The first stop was the bank. I sat across from a young woman who spoke slowly and smiled politely. She asked for my ID, then another form, then another. I handed them over without comment. She typed for a moment, then looked up at me. "You're still listed as the primary account holder," she said. I nodded, as if I already knew that. As if my heart wasn't pounding just a little. She turned the screen slightly toward me. Numbers, names, dates. Familiar and reassuring. Nothing had changed there. I thanked her and left without asking anything else. The next day, I went somewhere else. Quiet, professional. A place my husband and I had visited years ago, back when everything felt stable and predictable. The receptionist recognized my last name. "Oh," she said, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry for your loss." I thanked her. Sat down, waited. When the man across the desk began speaking, he used my full name, not my son's, not my daughter-in-law's. He asked careful questions. I answered them carefully. We spoke about documents, timelines, intentions, about things my husband had put in place long before anyone else thought to interfere. When I left, the sky looked different. Not brighter. Clearer. At home, nothing appeared to change. Dinner was served at the same time. The television volume stayed the same. My daughter-in-law still spoke as if the house were already hers. My son still avoided direct conversations. But I noticed things they didn't. A slight hesitation when they mentioned plans. A pause when I said I'd be out again tomorrow. A look exchanged between them when they thought I wasn't watching. They sensed something shifting. They just didn't know what. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law tested me. "So," she said casually, leaning against the counter, "have you thought any more about work?" I met her eyes and smiled. Not politely, calmly. "I'm taking care of it," I said. She waited for more. I didn't give it. That night, I wrote things down, dates, conversations, small details I had once brushed aside. Patterns became clearer when I saw them laid out in ink. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Their strategy had been pressure. Mine was patience. I moved my important papers into a folder and placed it at the bottom of my bag. Not hidden, just close. The following morning, as I reached for my coat, my son finally spoke. "You've been busy lately," he said. I nodded. "Yes." "With what?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment, then I answered truthfully, "Preparing." He didn't ask another question, and I didn't explain. For the first time since my husband died, I felt steady again. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer reacting. I was choosing, and that made all the difference. I began to see my past differently once I stopped trying to defend it. Small moments surfaced, one after another, as if they had been waiting for my attention. Things I had brushed aside because they seemed too minor to matter at the time. Like the first time my daughter-in-law suggested I stay home instead of joining them for a family outing. "You probably wouldn't enjoy it," she had said, smiling. I stayed. They didn't bring me back anything, or the holidays that slowly changed shape. The guest lists adjusted. The invitations arrived later and later, sometimes not at all. When I asked, there was always a reason. Scheduling, space, convenience. I accepted all of it. I told myself families evolve. I told myself not to take things personally. I told myself I was being sensible. But memory has a way of reorganizing itself once the truth comes into focus. I remembered how often I had stepped in when they needed help. Not loudly. Not with conditions. Just quietly, the way I always had. When my son lost his job for a few months, I covered groceries without mentioning it. When their car broke down, I wrote a check and said it was a gift. When childcare fell through, I rearranged my days without complaint. Each time, I told myself this was what mothers did. What I didn't see then was how easily support turned into expectation. By the time my husband died, they were already used to me being useful without being visible. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. One evening, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found a stack of birthday cards my husband had given me over the years. Short messages, steady handwriting. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was consistent. "Thank you for holding everything together. I don't say it enough, but I see you. This family works because of you." I sat there longer than I planned to, reading those lines again and again. No one had said things like that to me in a long time. Later that night, my daughter-in-law spoke openly at dinner, as if I weren't there. "If we're going to move forward," she said to my son, "we need to stop enabling certain habits." I took a sip of water and listened. My son nodded slowly. "Yeah, things can't stay the same forever." They didn't look at me, they didn't need to. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to interrupt, or to explain, or to remind them of everything I had done. I let the moment pass. In my room, I lined up the memories I had been avoiding, not to hurt myself, but to understand the pattern. Each sacrifice, each silence, each time I chose peace over clarity. It hadn't been a single betrayal. It had been accumulation. I realized then that grief had only made things visible. It hadn't created the problem. It had removed the distractions. The next morning, I folded those old cards and placed them in my bag. Not as proof, not as leverage. As a reminder. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being dramatic, and I wasn't wrong to protect myself now. When I left the house that day, my daughter-in-law called after me. "Where are you going?" I paused at the door, just long enough. "To take care of something that should have been handled a long time ago," I said. She didn't respond. And for once, that silence belonged to me. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. Just a subtle change in how they treated me, as if an invisible line had been crossed, and they weren't sure what was on the other side. My daughter-in-law watched me more closely now. When I picked up my purse, her eyes followed. When I left the house without explanation, she asked questions she hadn't bothered to ask before. "Are you meeting someone? Do you need the car? How long will you be gone?" I answered politely, briefly, never fully. My son grew quieter. He lingered in doorways, listening when I was on the phone, pretending not to. When I came home later than usual one afternoon, he glanced at the clock and then away again. Nothing was said. Everything was noticed. That evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I stepped outside to take it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, familiar in a distant way. "We reviewed everything," the man said. "There's no ambiguity." I closed my eyes. He continued, explaining tales I already understood but needed to hear out loud. Dates, signatures, conditions that had been met years ago and couldn't be undone quietly. When the call ended, I stayed outside for a moment longer. The air was cool. The porch light buzzed softly above me. Inside, I could hear the television and the low murmur of conversation. I went back in without comment. At dinner, my daughter-in-law talked about future plans as if they were already settled. Remodeling ideas, storage solutions, changes she wanted to make once things were simplified. I listened while I ate. When she paused, waiting for my agreement, I met her eyes and nodded once. Nothing more. That unsettled her. The next morning, she confronted me directly. Not aggressively, carefully. "You've been acting different," she said. I smiled. "Have I?" "Yes," she replied quickly. "You're distracted." I considered that. "No," I said. "I'm focused." She didn't like that answer. Later that day, I noticed the boxes in the hallway had been moved back into the garage. My dishes reappeared in the cabinet. My chair returned to its place at the table. Small adjustments, quiet corrections, they were recalculating. That night, my son knocked on my door. He stood awkwardly, as if unsure whether to step inside. "Mom," he said, "we should probably talk." I waited. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page," he continued. "About expectations." "Expectations," I nodded slowly. "I agree." He looked relieved. "Good, because we don't want any misunderstandings." Neither did I. In my room, I laid out everything I had gathered so far. Notes, copies, timelines. Not to memorize them, but to remind myself that this wasn't emotional anymore. It was procedural. The power dynamic had shifted, and they felt it. They just didn't know why yet. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The following afternoon, my daughter-in-law made one last attempt to regain control. "We're thinking of making some changes soon," she said lightly. "Big decisions." I looked at her, calm, unmoved. "Yes," I replied. "I know." Her smile faltered. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt ahead of things instead of behind them. They believed the pressure had worked, that I was adjusting, preparing to leave. Yet they didn't realize I was preparing for something else entirely. And when the time came, there would be no shouting, just clarity. By then, I had stopped reacting altogether. Not because I was tired, because I was ready. The house returned to its routines, but they felt staged now. My daughter-in-law spoke carefully, measuring each word. My son avoided firm statements, as if afraid they might land somewhere he didn't expect. They were adjusting their tone. I was adjusting my timing. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. They didn't lower their voices enough. "If she's still here by the end of the month, this is going to get complicated," my daughter-in-law said. My son sighed. "She said she's handling things." "That's what worries me," she replied. I didn't step in. I didn't make my presence known. I let the conversation end naturally, the way unfinished plans always do when people realize they might be overheard. That evening, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, just a practical one. I gathered the documents I'd been organizing and placed them in a folder. Not everything, only what mattered. I slid the folder into my bag and zipped it closed. The next morning, I dressed as I always did. Simple clothes, neutral colors, nothing that invited comment. As I reached the door, my daughter-in-law called out, "You're going out again?" "Yes," I said. "Job interview?" she asked, half smiling. I turned toward her. My voice stayed even. "No." She waited. I didn't add anything. At the place I went that morning, no one rushed me. No one spoke over me. They used my name, asked direct questions, gave direct answers. We reviewed timelines, options, consequences. "What do you want to do?" the man asked finally. I thought for a moment. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it clearly. "I want things to be accurate," I said. "Nothing more." He nodded. "That can be arranged." When I returned home, my son was waiting in the living room, sitting upright, hands folded. He looked uncomfortable. "We should talk," he said. I set my bag down slowly. "All right." He gestured to the couch. I remained standing. "I just want to understand what's going on," he said. "You've been distant." I met his eyes. "I've been precise." He frowned slightly. "About what?" "About what I say," I replied, "and what I don't." Silence settled between us. He glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "You're not planning to cause trouble, are you?" he asked. The question was careful. So was my answer. "No," I said. "I'm planning to prevent confusion." He didn't seem satisfied, but he nodded anyway. That night, I slept lightly, but without anxiety. The kind of sleep that comes when you know the next step, even if you haven't taken it yet. The following day, a letter arrived. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on the table and finished my tea first. Then I opened it carefully and read it once. Then again. Everything was there. Clear. Formal. Final. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Down the hallway, I could hear my daughter-in-law laughing at something on her phone. Comfortable. Certain. I stood up, smoothed the front of my sweater, and picked up the envelope. The pressure had been theirs. The silence was mine. And soon, so would the truth. They made their move sooner than I expected. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind that usually passed quietly. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a cup, when my daughter-in-law walked in holding a stack of papers. She didn't sit down. She stood across from me, confident, prepared. "We've been talking," she said, glancing briefly toward the hallway where my son lingered. "And we think it's time to be practical." Practical. That word again. She placed the papers on the table, sliding them toward me as if they were a favor. I dried my hands slowly before looking down. Printed listings, small apartments, senior communities, distances measured in miles, all carefully chosen. Not too close, not too far, just far enough to be inconvenient. "We found some good options," she continued. "Affordable, manageable, places where you won't have to worry about upkeep." I looked at the pages without touching them. My son cleared his throat. "It's not about pushing you out, Mom," he said. "It's about planning ahead." Planning ahead. They stood there together, waiting for my reaction. I could see it in their posture. They expected resistance, tears, questions, something they could manage. I gave them none of that. "I see," I said. My daughter-in-law relaxed slightly, mistaking calm for agreement. "Good, because this way everything stays friendly." Friendly, as if friendliness had been the problem. She tapped the papers. "If you can make a decision soon, it'll make the transition smoother." Transition. I finally picked up one of the pages. "Read it. Set it back down." "You've already decided," I said, not accusing, just stating. They exchanged a glance. "We're just trying to help." My son said, "Help." I nodded once. "Thank you." That seemed to confuse them. Later that afternoon, my daughter-in-law cornered me while my son was out. Her voice dropped, losing its careful tone. "I don't want this to get uncomfortable," she said. "Dragging things out won't help anyone." I met her eyes. "I agree." She leaned closer. "Then you should understand that staying here isn't realistic." There it was, not shouted, not dressed up, just stated plainly. I folded the paper in my hands and set it aside. "I understand exactly what you're trying to do." She stiffened. "I'm trying to do what's best." "For whom?" I asked. She didn't answer. That evening, they talked freely again, assuming the conversation was finished. I listened from my room as they discussed timelines, budgets, what they would change once everything was settled. They were building a future on an assumption. The next morning, I did something small. I scheduled a meeting. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint. I simply put on my coat and left the house as usual. When I returned, my son was waiting again. "Did you think about the places we showed you?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And?" he pressed. I met his eyes. "They won't be necessary." His expression shifted. "What do you mean?" I picked up my bag and walked past him. "I mean your plan won't work." He stood there, stunned, as if the script had changed without warning. Behind him, my daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me?" she said sharply. I turned to face her. Calm, unmoved. "You assumed I had no options," I said. "That was your mistake." The room went quiet. They had tried pressure. They had tried politeness. They had tried presenting my removal as kindness. None of it had worked. And now they were running out of time. I went to my room and closed the door behind me, gently. For the first time since my husband died, I knew exactly where this was headed. And so did they. The meeting happened on a Tuesday. Not at home. Not at the kitchen table where I'd been spoken down to. In a quiet office with neutral walls and chairs that didn't belong to anyone. My son arrived first. He looked tense, adjusting his jacket as if it didn't fit quite right. My daughter-in-law came in a moment later, composed, her expression confident in the way people are when they believe the outcome is already decided. They sat together. I sat across from them. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. The man at the head of the table opened a folder and began using words like clarification and documentation and standing instructions. Each phrase landed cleanly, without emotion. I watched their faces change. At first, my daughter-in-law smiled politely, nodding along as if this were a formality. My son leaned back slightly, arms crossed, waiting for it to be over. Then the tone shifted. The man turned a page. He addressed me directly, using my full name. He explained what had been established years ago, what had been signed, What could not be altered without my consent? I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. My daughter-in-law stopped nodding. My son uncrossed his arms. Questions came next. From them. Carefully worded at first, then faster. Sharper. That doesn't make sense, my daughter-in-law said. We were told... The man raised his hand gently. What you were told doesn't change what's legally binding. Silence followed. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Steady. Unbothered. My son looked at me then. Really looked. Not as his mother. Not as someone to manage. But as someone who had information he didn't. You knew? He asked quietly. I understood, I replied. That was all. The man continued. He laid out what would happen next. What wouldn't happen. What authority existed and where it ended. No threats, no lectures, just facts. My daughter-in-law shifted in her chair. Her voice, when she spoke again, was tighter. So what now? She asked. The man looked at me. I considered the question, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to answer it without anger. Now, I said, things are accurate. The meeting ended shortly after that. In the hallway, my son tried to speak to me. His voice wavered between apology and confusion. I didn't know, he said. She handled most of it. I stopped walking and faced him. I believe you, I said. That doesn't change what happened. He nodded slowly as if absorbing a truth he hadn't prepared for. My daughter-in-law didn't speak to me at all. Back at the house, the air felt heavier, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after certainty disappears. They moved carefully now, avoided assumptions, avoided me. That night, I sat alone in my room and thought about how close I had come to leaving without a word, to believing the story they were trying to tell me about myself. Old. Dependent. In the way. None of it had been true. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened anyone. I hadn't needed to. I had let the truth speak, and it had spoken clearly enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. The balance had shifted. They felt it. So did I. The house settled slowly after that. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just piece by piece, the way truth always does. My daughter-in-law stopped making plans out loud. She stopped referring to the house as if it were already hers. The confidence that once filled every room withdrew into something quieter, more cautious. My son changed too. He spoke less, but when he did, he looked at me. Really looked. As if seeing me for the first time in a long while. No apologies came. I didn't expect them. Some things, once broken, don't need words. They need distance, understanding, time. I remained where I was, not because I had won, but because I had never lost the right to stay. One evening I sat alone in the living room with the lamp on low, the same chair, the same worn armrest where my husband used to rest his hand. I could almost hear him clearing his throat before speaking, the way he always did when he had something important to say. You handled it, I imagined him saying. I smiled to myself. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended my worth. I hadn't begged to be treated with respect. I had simply refused to disappear. That night, I took out the note he'd written all those years ago. The one that said I was protected. I read it once more, then placed it back in the drawer. I didn't need it anymore. The protection wasn't just on paper. It was in knowing who I was before grief tried to erase me. Before silence made others bold enough to rewrite my place in my own life. The next morning I made breakfast as usual. Coffee, toast, nothing fancy. When my daughter-in-law entered the kitchen, she hesitated. Good morning, she said. Good morning, I replied. It was simple, civil, enough. Later, my son asked if I needed anything from the store. I told him no. I appreciated the question, though. Small changes. Real ones. They didn't ask me about my plans anymore. They didn't assume my weakness. They didn't talk around me, and I didn't need them to understand everything. I just needed them to stop pretending I was nothing without their permission. Some evenings, I walked through the house slowly, past the framed photos, past the marks on the wall where my son once measured his height, past the door my husband held open for me day after day, without fail. I belong here. Not because of documents, not because of meetings, but because I built a life here, brick by brick, year by year. When my daughter-in-law once shouted, "Get a job or get out," she thought she was issuing an order. What she didn't know was that I had already done the work of loving, the work of holding a family together, the work of standing still when being pushed would have been easier. I didn't need to leave to prove my strength. I stayed. And in staying, I reminded them all of something they had forgotten. I was never the burden. I was the foundation.